Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be unpacking some seriously thought-provoking questions about AI and society,
Yeah.
all stemming from this fascinating episode of AI debates.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating topic. And, one of the things that I find so captivating about AI is this sort of duality to it,
Yeah.
right? It has this incredible potential to level the playing field, make things more equitable. But at the same time, it also has this potential to, kind of worsen these inequalities that we already struggle with.
It's like this superpower that we've discovered,
Yeah.
but we don't have the instruction manual for it.
Yeah.
And we kind of have to figure it out as we go along. We see that, I think, in the example of education coming up a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like personalized learning
Mm.
tailored to a student's needs. It sounds amazing on paper, right?
Yeah.
But what about the students who don't even get access to that technology in the first place?
That's exactly it. It's like the
Okay.
difference between equality and equity. Equality is treating everyone the same way, but equity is really about making sure that everyone gets what they need to succeed.
Okay.
And that's a much more nuanced
Absolutely.
and honestly much more difficult thing to achieve, particularly when you're talking about programming AI, to understand those nuances,
Right.
to understand all of the complexities of human disadvantage and societal structures. It's a huge ask.
It's almost like we're trying to teach empathy to a machine before we fully understand it ourselves,
Right.
which is a little bit of a scary thought. And the stakes get even higher when you start thinking about AI being used in something like hiring processes, right?
Mm-hmm.
If these systems are trained on data that's already biased, are we not just going to end up perpetuating those biases instead getting rid of them?
Exactly. We can't just kind of cross our fingers and hope for the best and assume that AI is going to be fair and impartial. Like you said, it all comes down to the data.
Yeah.
And if we're not incredibly careful about the data that we use to train these systems, we're essentially baking discrimination into the algorithms themselves.
And that's the scary part, right?
It,
It's not like some actively malicious thing necessarily, but just that these unintended consequences can be so huge because we haven't thought through carefully enough, like you said, the data that we're feeding into this incredibly powerful tool.
Yeah. And it's not a set it and forget it situation, right? It's
Yeah.
not like we can just train these AI systems on a data set once
Right.
and then just let them run wild.
Right.
We need to be constantly monitoring their impact, tweaking the algorithms, making sure that they're actually achieving the outcomes that we want.
So it's this constant process of monitoring and adjusting and making sure that we're staying on top of it.
And that we're not relinquishing our own ethical responsibility, right?
Right.
AI might be able to process information on a scale that we can only dream of, but it's still up to us to define those values, those ethical boundaries that it operates within.
To be the shepherds of this technology, even as it's becoming more and more sophisticated.
Yeah.
And speaking of ethical dilemmas and things that are becoming very complex, very quickly, we have to talk about, I think, kind of the elephant in the room, which is this potential for AI to become super intelligent, right? I mean, this is something that even Elon Musk is worried about. And when Elon Musk is worried, everybody starts paying attention.
Right. And that brings us to this whole other can of worms, which is the debate around existential risk with AI. And, it's not so much about AI becoming evil like we see in the movies.
Right. It's not like some Hollywood scenario where the AI suddenly becomes sentient and decides to take over the world.
Exactly.
Or at least we hope not.
At least not yet, but it's more about this potential for misaligned goals, right?
Okay.
What happens when we give AI objectives that seem perfectly reasonable in theory, but then when you actually implement it in the real world, it has these unintended consequences that spiral out of control.
So it's less about malicious intent and more about just the law of unintended consequences, but amplified because we're talking about a technology that could potentially be so much more powerful than we are.
Precisely. And that's why I think this discussion about existential risk needs to be nuanced. We can't just completely dismiss it.
Right.
Because there is a real potential for things to go very wrong. But at the same time, we can't let these hypothetical doomsday scenarios completely overshadow the very real and pressing ethical challenges that we're facing right now with AI.
So as captivating as it is to think about, the Terminator scenario and, AI becoming super intelligent, we can't lose sight of the here and now. And there are some really big issues that are already impacting people right now.
Absolutely.
We're talking about AI-powered surveillance. The potential for AI to be used to manipulate elections through targeted misinformation. I mean, these are not distant threats. This is stuff that's happening in our world today.
And we need to be having these discussions about ethics and regulation now while we're still in these relatively early stages of AI development. The decisions that we make today, the precedents that we set, are going to have a ripple effect for years, if not decades to come.
It's like we're building the foundation of a skyscraper. We want to make sure that it's strong and stable before we start adding all these extra floors onto it. And speaking of which, how are different countries and organizations even approaching this whole AI regulation thing? I mean, what are the major schools of thought out there?
Well, it's kind of like the Wild West out there right now. You've got all these different approaches emerging. You've got these global initiatives like UNESCO's ethics guidelines, which are a good starting point, but they're not legally binding, right?
But they're more like strongly worded suggestions than actual enforceable rules.
Exactly. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have something like the EU's AI Act, which is probably the most ambitious attempt so far to really regulate AI in a comprehensive way.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about that, and it seems like they're really trying to categorize AI systems based on their risk level.
No, that's exactly right. So a system that's recommending movies to you on Netflix is going to be treated very differently than, say, an AI system that's being used in healthcare to make life or death decisions.
Makes sense. So higher stakes equals stricter rules.
Yeah.
So what does that actually look like in practice? Like, how do they differentiate between those?
So for high-risk AI systems, things like we were talking about in healthcare or self-driving cars, the EU wants to see much stricter requirements in place, things like really rigorous testing of the data, ensuring that the algorithms are transparent and explainable, and making sure that there's always human oversight involved.
So it's not just like, okay, computer, you decide who gets the surgery.
Exactly.
There's still a human in the loop there. It looks like a pretty bold move, though. Are people concerned that this is going to stifle innovation?
That's definitely one of the big criticisms, that these regulations could be too burdensome, particularly for smaller startups who are trying to break into the AI field.
Right, because they don't have the same resources as these big companies who can hire,
exactly,
a whole legal team to figure all this stuff out.
Exactly. And then there's also the question of whether any regulation can really keep pace with how quickly this technology is evolving.
Right, because it's like a moving target. Like you put a rule in place today, and then tomorrow there's a new advancement. And suddenly that rule is obsolete.
And even if we do manage to create some kind of global rule book for AI, how do we account for the fact that different cultures around the world have very different ideas about what's ethical and what's not?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because something like AI-powered surveillance, for example, might be completely accepted in some societies and totally rejected in others. So how do you navigate that when you're talking about AI on a global scale?
You've hit on probably the most challenging aspect of all of this, which is trying to regulate something when our ethical standards aren't universal. And they're not right. Values are shaped by so many different factors, cultural norms, history, political systems. It's incredibly complex. So to think that we're going to come up with a one-size-fits-all approach to AI regulation is probably unrealistic. I think what we really need is this ongoing open dialogue, a global conversation, where policymakers, tech experts, ethicists, and honestly just everyday people are coming together and figuring out how to shape this technology in a way that reflects our shared values.
It's almost like AI is forcing humanity to take a really long, hard look in the mirror.
Absolutely.
And not just about our technological capabilities, but also what we actually believe in.
It's forcing us to define our values in a way that we haven't really had to before.
Right, because it's not just like, can we build it? It's, should we?
Exactly.
And if so, how do we make sure that it's actually used for good?
Yeah. And those aren't easy questions to answer.
Not at all.
But they're questions that we need to be asking ourselves, and we need to be asking them right now. The future of AI, it's not some predetermined outcome.
Right.
It's being written right now through the choices that we make, the conversations we have, the actions that we take.
So what can we even do as individuals? I mean, aside from maybe brushing up on our coding skills.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel a little bit powerless in the face of all this, right? Like this wave is crashing over us.
Yeah.
And we're just kind of standing here like, what do we do?
Right. Well, I think the first thing is to remember that you're not powerless. There's actually a lot that you can do, and it starts with becoming informed.
Yeah.
There are some incredible organizations out there doing really important work on AI ethics. Groups like the AI Now Institute, the Future of Life Institute. They're doing fascinating research on everything from algorithmic bias to the impact of AI on the workforce. And they have a lot of resources that are available to the public.
Yeah, I've seen some of their stuff, and it's really interesting, and it's surprisingly accessible.
Exactly. It's not just for academics and engineers.
Right.
They do a really good job of breaking these complex issues down in a way that anyone can understand.
So, yeah, do your research, get informed.
Yeah.
What then? What do we do with that information?
Well, once you're armed with that knowledge, that's when you can start to actually shape the conversation. Contact your elected officials. Let them know that AI ethics and regulation are important to you.
Right.
Support organizations that are fighting for responsible AI development. I mean, even just talking to your friends and family about these issues, raising awareness can be incredibly powerful.
It's about changing that narrative from AI being something that just happens to us to something that we can actually have a say in.
Exactly.
Right.
We're not just passive bystanders in this. We have agency. We have a voice.
We can help steer this ship.
Absolutely.
Well said. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here today.
We have.
From the incredible potential of AI to, improve lives, to the very real risks of bias and unintended consequences. We talked about this whole ethical minefield, the regulation debates,
Right.
the possibility of AI even exceeding human intelligence one day. It's a lot to wrap your head around as we kind of come to the end here.
It is.
What is the one thing that you really want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that your voice matters. Don't disengage just because it feels too complicated or too technical.
Right.
Read articles, listen to podcasts like this one, talk to people, form your own opinions about this technology and the role that you want it to play in society. Because the more informed all of us are, the better equipped we'll be to really navigate all of the incredible opportunities and challenges that AI presents.
We're all collectively writing this next chapter in the story of AI.
We are.
And we need diverse voices and perspectives to make it a chapter worth reading. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into AI and society. We hope you found it insightful and engaging and maybe even a little bit inspiring. And until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, keep the conversation going.